The thermometer on the comms tent read 48 degrees. No one looked at it anymore. Heat like that stops being a number. It becomes a texture, the dry scrape of air inside the throat, the shimmer rising off the airstrip in slow, nauseating waves, the way metal burns through gloves when you reach for a rifle. The forward operating base Kestrel sat in the middle of nothing. 12 tents, 2 hardened structures, a water tower that groaned in the afternoon wind, and a perimeter fence baking rust into the sand, 200 kilometers from the nearest paved road, 400 from anything that could be called a city. The base had been carved into a basin between 2 ridge lines. It gave cover from the north and the east. It gave nothing else. From the south, the desert opened flat and featureless for 30 kilometers. White hardpan, cracked like old porcelain, dotted with low scrub that turned gray in the heat. There was no shade out there, no relief. On a day like this, mirages walked the horizon, and a man's brain started inventing rivers. Staff Sergeant Drew Calloway had been at Kestrel for 11 days. He'd stopped counting after the first 3. He stood outside the command tent with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching a dust devil tear itself apart against the wire. The base was running at half capacity. Most of the forward elements had rotated south the previous week. What remained was a reduced intelligence cell, a communications team, a 4-man medical detachment, and 2 sniper pairs drawn from different units, one from the 75th Ranger Regiment, one from SOCOM's 1st Special Forces Group. Calloway ran the Rangers pair. His spotter, Corporal Vince Harlow, was a quiet man from rural Montana who had the patience of a geologist. The intelligence brief had come in at 0530. The target was a man named Soren Voss. Not his real name, a call sign that had survived 6 years of proxy wars, weapons transfers, and at least 3 confirmed mass casualty events. Intel placed him as the operational coordinator for a network responsible for 4 major attacks in the past 18 months. He traveled in small cells, always moving. He slept 3 hours a night in different locations. He had survived 2 previous elimination attempts, 1 drone strike, 1 direct action raid through a combination of discipline, luck, and informants inside the coalition's own support structure. He had been located 40 minutes ago. That was the extraordinary thing. Soren Voss, ghost of the Eastern Corridor, had been spotted by a UAV performing routine ISR over the Karat Escarpment, a series of sandstone ridges 22 kilometers south-southeast of Kestrel. He was in a small compound at the base of the escarpment, apparently inspecting something inside a vehicle. The UAV had maintained a high orbit to avoid alerting the cell's electronic surveillance. The drone operator had flagged the sighting within 4 minutes. The problem was, the compound sat behind a natural rock shelf at an elevation of approximately 60 meters above the flat. Direct vehicle access was a 40-minute approach across open hardpan, suicidal in daylight with the cell's known counter-surveillance capability. Air assets were 40 minutes out minimum. A strike package needed another 30 minutes of coordination. Voss had never stayed in one location for more than 2 hours. The window was already burning. The second problem was distance. Calloway stood now and did the math he'd already done 3 times. The only viable firing position was a ridge spur on the eastern approach designated Overlook Sierra, which put the shooter approximately 3,180 meters from the compound's visible access point, 3.1 kilometers. At that distance, a standard .338 Lapua, their best available caliber, was at the absolute edge of its reliable ballistic envelope. Theoretically possible, practically, almost never done. The world record for a confirmed kill with a bolt-action rifle sat at a hair over 3,400 meters, achieved in ideal conditions by one of the best-trained shooters alive with hours of preparation. They had 38 minutes. Calloway walked into the command tent. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Haynes stood over the central table, sleeves down, jaw tight. He was 51, lean, gray at the temples, with the flat eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades making decisions he couldn't take back. Around him, 2 intel analysts, a communications officer, and Master Sergeant Evan Poole, the SOCOM sniper team lead, a man with a chest full of decorations and the reputation to match. Poole had been in the room when Calloway entered. So had she. Calloway almost missed her. She was standing to the left of the table, slightly back from the others, wearing a standard-issue tan uniform with no visible unit patch, mid-30s, maybe, light brown hair pulled tight. Neither tall nor short. She held a mug of something hot and stared at the tactical overlay on the screen with an expression that gave nothing away, not tension, not boredom, not anything. Calloway didn't know her. He didn't ask. Not yet. Calloway. Haynes didn't look up. What's your range estimate on Sierra? 3180, give or take 20. Depends where in the compound we're shooting. Poole says 3250. Poole crossed his arms. Could be 3400 if Voss moves to the North Vehicle Bay. And he might. That's where the UAV tracked him 20 minutes ago. 3400 with a 338 inches this heat, and this wind, Calloway said. That's difficult, Haynes said. I know, I was going to say impractical, I was going to say doable, Poole said. He said it the way men say things they've already decided. We prep the position, we wait for Vass to come south into better range, we take the shot, and if he doesn't come south, then we adapt. Calloway said nothing. He was watching the intel analyst update the position overlay, the red dot that represented Voss shifting slightly toward the north end of the compound. Going the wrong way, we're burning time, one of the analysts said. Movement pattern suggests he could be prepping to leave in the next 20 to 30 minutes. Haynes looked up then. His eyes moved around the table, Poole, Calloway, the analysts. Then, for just a moment, they moved to the woman on the left. She hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. Prep Sierra, Haynes said. Poole, Calloway, you have 10 minutes to stage. We push the shot window to as long as we have. Poole nodded. He was already moving toward the door. Calloway followed. He passed the woman on his way out. Close enough to read her sleeve. Still no unit patch. Just a name tape on her right chest. Reeves. He didn't know the name either. The drive to overlook Sierra took 7 minutes in a hardened LMTV running without headlights across the southern approach trail. Calloway and Harlow rode in the back. Poole and his spotter, Sergeant First Class Nathan Kessler, sat across from them. Nobody talked. The spur was a finger of sandstone jutting eastward from the main ridge line. Elevation approximately 280 meters above the basin floor. It gave a direct line of sight south-southeast across the hardpan to the Karrat Escarpment. It had been used as a sniper overwatch position twice before, but never at ranges approaching 3,000 meters. They arrived at the base of the spur at 0707. The climb took 9 minutes, loose shale, 40-degree incline, no trail. The sun was already burning off the eastern horizon and painting the rock in shades of iron and gold. Beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with beauty, the kind of landscape that made you feel very small and very temporary. Calloway reached the lip of the spur and lay flat on the stone. He glassed the escarpment. The compound was barely visible at this range, a smear of gray-brown against the rock face, resolving slowly into a wall line and two vehicle shapes as his eye adjusted. The north vehicle bay was a gap in the wall on the far left. That was where Voss had been tracked. Wind. Harlow murmured beside him. Calloway had been tracking it since they left the base. It was the problem. The desert wind at this time of morning ran northeast to southwest in the lower valley, but the escarpment created its own microclimate, heated air rising off the stone face, creating an upward thermal that interacted with the prevailing wind at approximately the midpoint of the shot. That midpoint turbulence was where bullets went wrong. It was where the trajectory prediction models became guesses. Poole set up 15 meters to Calloway's left. His weapon was a 338 Lapua Accuracy International AXMC, the same platform Calloway ran. Standard issue for precision operations at this classification. I'm showing variable wind at mid-range, Kessler said, his eye to the spotting scope. 11 to 16 knots, changing direction by 10 to 15 degrees every 30 to 40 seconds. Poole was already dialing his scope. Run the ballistic calculation, he said. Kessler entered the parameters into the Kestrel Applied Ballistics computer, a handheld device the size of a phone that took muzzle velocity, temperature, humidity, elevation, and the shooter's altitude above sea level and produced a firing solution. It was a good piece of equipment. It was accurate in conditions its engineers had modeled. This was not those conditions. Solution showing 14.8 mil elevation, 2.2 mil right wind hold at current reading, Kessler said. But wind is walking. If it shifts 15 degrees left before impact, we miss left. Correct. Poole looked through the scope. Long seconds. The sun was climbing. The air was already distorting at the mid-range, creating that shimmer that ate accuracy. He fired at 0719. The shot was clean. Calloway tracked downrange through his scope, saw the puff of dust at the base of the escarpment wall. Low and left by approximately 2.5 meters. Wind had walked. Poole adjusted. Fired again. Low again. Less, but low. Kessler was adjusting rapidly, re-entering parameters, watching the wind flags they'd placed on the spur edge. Wind shifted again. I can't hold a stable solution. It's oscillating. How far is Voss from the south wall? Poole said. 30 meters minimum. Poole fired a third time. Kessler called the hit a meter left, a meter low. 3 rounds expended. No solution found. The wind at mid-range was not following a model. It was following its own logic. Calloway set his eye back to his scope and did what he always did when situations became unfair. He watched. Calloway's radio crackled at 0731. Sierra, this is Kestrel Actual. We have a revised estimate. Target is preparing to move. Vehicle activity confirmed at North Bay. You have a window of approximately 15 to 20 minutes before we lose him. What is your assessment? Poole keyed his radio. Working the solution. Wind is the variable. Requesting. There's no time to request anything, Haynes said. Give me a yes or a no. Poole looked at Calloway. Calloway had no answer that would help. Poole clicked the radio. We are at high confidence for a solution in the next 5 to 10 minutes. It was not a lie, exactly. But it was not the truth either. He fired a fourth time, wide right by nearly 2 meters. The wind had lurched again. Harlow watched through the spotting scope and said nothing. His face was completely still. Harlow was a man who did not waste expressions. He saved them for the things that genuinely required reaction, which meant his stillness now was not stoicism, it was the careful silence of someone who was watching a situation deteriorate and had no useful information to add to it. Calloway had been working with him for 2 years and knew the difference. That was when Calloway heard the crunch of boots on the shale behind them. He turned. She came up the spur alone, carrying a weapon case and a small canvas bag over one shoulder. The same woman from the command tent Reeves. She moved over the loose stone with an economy of movement that Calloway recognized from people who had spent serious time at altitude in rough conditions. Mountain climbers had it. High-altitude special reconnaissance operators had it. The unconscious efficiency of a body that has learned to conserve energy in environments that will drain it without mercy. Not hurried. Not cautious, just precise in the expenditure of effort. She reached the lip and laid the case down flat without ceremony. As if she'd been here before. Poole turned and looked at her. His expression was professional, the specific blankness of a man who was reserving judgment but had already formed one. She said nothing. You're out of your lane, Poole said. His voice was careful. Not hostile, just precise. The voice of a man who had spent 16 years in precision fires and had learned that most problems on a firing position could be avoided by having the right people and none of the wrong ones. She opened the case. The weapon inside was not standard, and was not close to standard. Calloway recognized the platform after a moment, a heavily modified bolt-action built around a 408 ATAC chassis, with a custom free-float barrel at least 4 inches longer than factory specification. The suppressor was clearly not factory either, it was larger than standard, probably hand-built to match the barrel's specific harmonic profile. The scope was a Schmidt, Bender Fem Femok 4x6 trades PM2 with a custom turret system, the kind of glass that costs serious money, and was worth every cent of it. The stock had been modified with a right-hand thumbhole cutout and a cheek piece that had been rebuilt from scratch. She had remolded it to fit a specific geometry. Her geometry. The whole system had been built by someone who treated this weapon as a relationship rather than a tool. We don't have time for amateurs, Poole said. Flat. Final. The sentence was meant to land like a door closing. She looked at him for exactly 1 second. Not with hostility. Not with performance. The way you look at a piece of information that does not change what you were already going to do. Then she looked back at the escarpment. The wind floor is switching at approximately 1,600 meters, she said. Her voice was quiet, measured, the same tone you'd use to explain a route on a map. Your solution is being calculated at point of departure. You're not accounting for the thermal bounce off the rock face at terminal range. The escarpment is running about 11 degrees hotter than the surrounding air temperature. It's creating a micro-vortex on the downrange face. Your bullet is walking left because it's catching the outer edge of that vortex about 200 meters before impact and deflecting. Hisla style here. Poole said nothing. That's a theory, Calloway said. Because someone had to say something, and it was the most neutral thing available. Run your next shot 6 degrees right of your current hold, she said. She lay down beside her case and began assembling the rifle. Her hands moved without looking, each piece finding its place from memory barrel into chassis, scope onto rail, suppressor threaded onto crown, bipod unfolded and locked. 16, maybe 18 seconds total. She never looked down. See what happens. Poole looked at Calloway. Calloway looked at Harlow. Harlow looked at nothing, and waited with the patience of someone who had already decided that watching the outcome was more useful than contributing to the argument. You're asking me to. I'm not asking you anything. She clicked the bipod legs into their final position without glancing at them. I'm telling you what your data is missing. You can do whatever you want with that. Poole turned back to his scope. He dialed 6 degrees right, which went against everything his training and his instrument were telling him. He fired, half a meter low, approximately 2 feet right of center mass. Not the solution. But the wind behavior was different. The shot had tracked predictably to the right holdover rather than walking left in the sudden terminal vortex corridor. The problem was now identifiable and specific. The thermal bounce off the escarpment face was adding a downward component to the deflection that the basic vortex model didn't capture. He was missing the bounce, but she had been right about the vortex. Poole stared into the scope for a moment. You're right about the vortex, Kessler said slowly. He was looking at his data now, rereading the shot trace, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man recalibrating. I know, she said. She settled into her prone position, adjusting the sandbag she'd pulled from the canvas bag and placed under the rifle's chassis. Her left cheek found the stock comb. She was still. entirely still. The radio crackled at 0739. Sierra, we are showing vehicle engines running at North Bay. Revised window is 5 to 8 minutes. Confirm status. Poole was redialing his scope. His jaw was tight. Working the solution, he said. He was working it. But the problem now was not just the wind, the problem was time. Each adjustment took 30 seconds of observation to confirm. 5 minutes was 4 observations. If everything went perfectly, everything was not going perfectly. Calloway glassed the compound. The vehicles in the North Bay were active. He could see heat shimmer above the engine blocks. Someone was loading something into the rear of the lead truck. They're staging, Harlow said. How long to departure? 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Poole fired. The shot walked again, slightly better, but still off. He cursed once, quietly. 3 minutes. Calloway looked at Reeves. She had finished assembling her weapon. She was lying in a stable prone position, the rifle nested in a sandbag she'd produced from her bag, eye to the scope. She hadn't fired. She was watching. Her left hand rested flat on the ground, palm down, fingers spread. What are you waiting for? Calloway said. For it to be right, she said. We don't have. I know what we don't have. No edge in her voice, just information. Poole fired again. Same problem. The shot was tracking correctly to about 2,000 meters and then deflecting. The thermal vortex off the rock face was not a fixed variable, it was breathing with the morning temperature rise. Every minute that passed made it slightly worse. He's in the vehicle. One of the analysts said over the radio, driver is in the vehicle. Target has not yet boarded but is moving toward the vehicle. Haynes's voice replaced the analyst's. Sierra, this is your last window. Give me an assessment. Poole dropped his eye from the scope. Just for a half second, the first time Calloway had seen him do that. He clicked the radio. Need additional 60 seconds. You don't have 60 seconds. Poole. The silence on the radio was the kind that contained an entire conversation. Haynes said, "Who else is up there?" Poole said nothing. Calloway keyed his radio. "We have a third shooter on position, Colonel." Another silence. "Reeves?" Haynes's voice was different now, not softer, more careful. She heard it. She didn't look up from the scope. "Yes, sir," she said, loud enough for the radio to catch. The longest pause yet. 7 seconds. 8. Give her the shot, Haynes said. Poole looked at her. Her eye never left the scope. She did not use the Kestrel ballistic computer. She did not use the wind flags on the spur edge. She lay flat on the stone with the rifle's stock pressed against her right shoulder, left hand open on the ground, right hand loose around the grip. The suppressor extended out past the lip of the spur. Her breathing was slow. Calloway watched her. She was watching things he was not sure he could see. Her eyes, when she was not looking through the scope, tracked the desert between the spur and the escarpment in a pattern that was not random. Near to far, then back to near. Along the shadow line at the foot of the rock, which was still relatively sharp at this morning hour, shadow edges blur as the sun climbs and the stone heats evenly, so a sharp shadow meant the escarpment face was not yet fully saturated with heat. She registered this. He could tell because her eyes paused there before moving on, across the mid-range hardpan where the heat shimmer created visible distortion columns. She was not just watching the shimmer, she was measuring its height. The taller the shimmer column, the more intense the thermal layer. She was building a map of temperature differentials across 3 kilometers of open desert using nothing but her eyes. He realized after another minute that she was reading the air. Not with instruments. With her eyes, with whatever kind of attention a person develops over years of doing this in conditions where instruments are unavailable or unreliable or both. Coriolis is negligible at this range, Harlow murmured, more to himself than anyone. But the density altitude, she's not using altitude correction, Kessler said. She has to be. Watch her scope. The scope was not moving. She had set it and locked it. The elevation and windage turrets had not turned since she'd settled into position. She had made one adjustment, one when she'd first put her eye to the glass, and then locked everything. Calloway watched the ground between them and the target. She was watching a narrow band of air at approximately 1,600 meters. He was almost sure of it. There was a dust layer there, barely visible from the spur, the kind of gossamer layer that formed when the early morning wind pattern and the rising thermal from the hardpan interfaced at their exact point of equilibrium. It moved in slow pulses, irregular but cyclical, like something breathing. She was timing it. "What's your current wind call?" she said to no one in particular. Kessler checked his instruments. Variable at mid-range, 9 to 14 knots, oscillating. Ground level here is 7 knots northeast. "No," she said, "not the speed, the pause." Kessler looked at Harlow. Harlow looked at the dust layer at 1,600 meters and was quiet for a moment. "The wind here pauses," she said. There was no impatience in her explanation. She was stating facts. "There's a lull, 7 to 9 seconds between gusts at the floor of that thermal. Then it picks up again. The thermal at mid-range is on a separate cycle. It pulses on about a 14-second interval. I need those two cycles to align. That's Kessler started. She didn't finish his thought for him. She was back to watching. Calloway looked at his watch. They had possibly 2 minutes, maybe 3. He looked back at her. He looked at the way she lay. And he looked at it more carefully this time because there was something about it that had been nagging at him since she'd settled into position, and he hadn't been able to name it. Her left elbow was rotated outward from the shoulder, not the standard flat to the ground form they all used, but canted out at approximately 30 degrees, which dropped the shoulder socket further into the rifle's stock and created a different contact geometry. It meant the rifle was supported slightly from below rather than from the side, which distributed the rifle's weight through the skeletal structure of the shoulder rather than the muscle. Less fatigue, less wobble over long holds. Her cheek weld on the stock was lighter than standard. Most shooters press firmly, it anchors the eye behind the scope and prevents scope eye if the rifle kicks. But she had the cheek barely touching, which told Calloway that she expected to absorb recoil differently, or that she had rebuilt the stock's comb angle so precisely to her specific eye relief that firm contact wasn't necessary for consistent sight picture. Her right hand on the grip was loose. Not so loose that the rifle would move, loose enough that the muscles in her forearm were at rest. Active grip introduces tension. Tension introduces tremor. At 3,000 meters, a half millimeter of tremor at the muzzle translates to significant error at the target. She had built every element of her position around removing variables. Not controlling them, removing them. The vehicle in the North Bay had moved slightly. Voss was not yet inside it. The UAV feed confirmed he was still outside the compound wall, 15 meters from the vehicle door. But moving, unhurried, but moving. 90 seconds, maybe. She was breathing at a rate that seemed deliberately calibrated. Calloway counted it without meaning to. 1 complete cycle every 8 seconds. In through the nose, slow as water rising in a glass. Out through barely parted lips with a duration that was twice the inhale. The extended exhale was the tell. She was working a technique that had been documented in competitive long-range shooting communities, but almost never in operational environments, where time pressure usually prevented the patience required to implement it. It depressed heart rate by engaging the parasympathetic nervous system. It reduced the amplitude of the natural heartbeat pulse visible in high magnification scopes. It made stillness into something beyond physical. Her fingers on the stock had not moved in 90 seconds. She was waiting, not hesitating, waiting. There is a difference that most people never learn, and the difference is not about time, it is about whether the pause contains doubt. Hesitation is paralysis in the presence of uncertainty. Waiting is commitment in the presence of timing. She had committed. She was waiting for the moment she had already chosen. The dust on the hardpan at 1,600 meters shifted direction slightly, responding to some interaction of air masses that was invisible from the spur, and then for a moment that lasted exactly as long as she had predicted, it flattened. Both cycles. Together, her right hand moved a fraction. Not tightened, moved through a sequence, the way a pianist's hand moves through a chord, 3 distinct degrees of progressive closure that ended at the trigger's break point. Time does not actually slow down. The human brain cannot dilate physics. What it does instead is record flooding the working memory with detail that normally gets discarded, so that afterward the moment exists in the mind as something denser and longer than reality. Every soldier who has been at the center of something knows this effect. It is not heightened experience. It is heightened retention. The physics ran at exactly the same speed it always does. But afterward, Calloway could play back the next 4 seconds of his life in a way he could not play back most hours of his life. He was in the center of something. The spur was absolutely quiet. No wind, she had called it. The heat pushed down from a sky that had gone from white to pale yellow as the morning matured. The light was hard, the shadows on the rock face of the escarpment were knife-edged and motionless. Harlow had his eye to the spotting scope, and his whole body had gone into that particular stillness he found for long shots, the stillness of a man who has stepped slightly outside himself and become an instrument. Kessler had stopped talking. He was watching with the scope he'd been given for secondary observation, and his breathing had changed shallower, like someone in a theater at a high moment. Poole had his rifle down. That was the thing Calloway noticed most, before anything else happened. Poole had laid his rifle down on the rock and stepped back from his position and was watching downrange with naked eyes, arms crossed, jaw set. He had not been told to stand down. He had chosen to. Something in the past 3 minutes, the missed wind call, the thermal vortex explanation, the stillness of the woman beside him had moved something in him, not broken it, just moved it. He would not have called it what it was. No one on a firing position ever calls it what it is in the moment. But what it was recognition. The target was at the vehicle door. The UAV operator, back at Kestrel in the comms tent with headphones and a monitor, was watching the thermal signature of a man put his hand on a door handle. 3 kilometers south-southeast, across the cracked white hardpan and over the thermal layer and over the micro-vortex bouncing heat off sandstone, a man who had evaded 2 previous attempts and spent 6 years building a practice of survival was about to take another step. She put her eye tight to the scope. Her left hand, which had been flat on the ground palm down, rose slightly just the fingertips, not the heel, and came to rest against the rifle's chassis with the lightest possible contact, not for support. For information. She was reading the rifle the way a doctor reads a pulse, feeling the tiny vibration of the firing mechanism's internal state, the micro-tremor that runs through metal at rest. Calloway noticed something. She was not using standard form. Not any standard form he had been taught, or had seen taught, or had observed in any of the dozens of qualified snipers he'd worked alongside in the past 7 years. The angle of her elbow on the support was different, rotated outward, lowering her shoulder socket into the stock rather than pushing against it. The grip on the rifle had that quality he'd noticed before, present, but not gripping. Her cheek was on the comb, but barely. She looked like someone who had built the rifle around herself rather than the other way around, which was the only way to describe a dynamic that was otherwise hard to articulate. He had seen something like it once before, a competition shooter, years before he enlisted, at an amateur long-range match in Wyoming that a friend had dragged him to, a woman who had won 3 consecutive national titles in open-class long-range. She had shot like that, the same economy, the same apparent lightness of contact, as if she and the weapon had arrived at an agreement about what they were going to do and no force was required to maintain it. He'd been 23 and hadn't understood what he was watching. He understood it better now. The wind on the spur was at 0. The dust at 1,600 meters was at 0. The thermal from the hardpan was at the trough of its 14-second cycle. Everything aligned for 7 seconds. She had predicted 7 to 9. Poole said, barely audible, "The angle's wrong. She's aimed 4 degrees left of center mass." Calloway looked through his scope. Poole was correct. Her aim point was left of the target by something between 3 and 5 degrees, well outside the margin for error even with aggressive wind hold. It was not a correction. It was an entirely different point of aim than any solution Calloway or Poole had been working toward. "What is she doing?" Kessler said. He said it the way you say things when you already know the answer will not be satisfying. Harlow said nothing. She breathed out, half a breath, only the rest held in the suspension of the diaphragm at its neutral point, neither expanding nor contracting, the body at mechanical 0. She held. She squeezed the trigger, not pulled. Squeeze, the distinction is real, and it is everything at long range. A pull introduces lateral movement. A squeeze is a progressive reduction of space between the pad of the finger and the metal, distributed evenly, building to a break that should come as a mild surprise. The suppressed rifle made a sound like a hard cough. The round left the muzzle at approximately 915 meters per second. At 408 TAC specification, the projectile, a 305 grain solid copper bow tail, was designed to retain supersonic velocity past 2,000 meters. It was one of the few cartridges that remained genuinely stable at the range she was attempting. But the ballistics are not what Calloway would remember. What he would remember was the trajectory. He tracked it through the scope. He expected the round to go left. She had aimed left. He expected a miss, because the aim point was wrong. Because nothing about this had been according to procedure, because the wind computer had spent 20 minutes failing to find a solution, and she had spent 3 minutes lying on a rock watching dust move. The round did not go where she aimed. It went right. It corrected, mid-flight, catching the thermal vortex at 1,600 meters that everyone else had been fighting. Using it, she had fired into the vortex at an angle calculated to let the air current redirect the projectile the way a pitcher uses spin, not fighting the correction, committing to it. The bullet curved, not wildly, barely, a fraction of a degree across 3,000 meters. But at that distance, a fraction of a degree is everything. Calloway tracked the round for approximately 1.8 seconds, which is a long time to follow a bullet across 3 kilometers of heated desert air, and he watched it track right from her left aim point and curve back toward center and continue on its arc toward the north end of the compound, the vehicle bay. The door. Harlow had his spotting scope dialed to maximum. He said nothing for 2 seconds. Then, so quietly that only Calloway could hear, hit. No one cheered. Not immediately. Not for a long time. There is a version of this moment in stories where the team erupts, where hands are clasped and names are called on the radio, and the tension breaks into something warm and loud. That is not what happened on Overlook Sierra. What happened was silence. Harlow did not lift his eye from the spotting scope for a full 11 seconds. Calloway counted them. He did not look away from his own scope either. He was staring at the north bay of the compound, which through the glass was a small, distorted, shimmering rectangle of heat and shadow, and in the upper left corner of which something had fallen. Kessler said, finally, in a voice that had no performance in it, Confirmed. Then nothing again. Poole did not move for a long time. He was standing with his arms still crossed and his eyes on the escarpment and his face doing something that faces do when the mind is confronting information that contradicts its prior model of the world. It was not a pleasant expression. It was not an unpleasant one either. It was simply the expression of recalibration. Calloway lowered his rifle. He turned to look at her. She had already removed her eye from the scope. She was lying on her back on the stone now, staring up at the white-hot sky, the rifle resting across her legs. She did not look satisfied. She did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had just finished a calculation and was waiting for the next problem. Calloway said, "How?" She looked at him. "How what?" "The aim point. You were left of center by 4 degrees. 3.8, she said. You fired into the vortex on purpose." She sat up. Her hands began breaking down the rifle, efficiently, the way she'd assembled it. "The vortex runs at an angle," she said. "Southwest to northeast at about 30 degrees off the horizontal. If you fight it, you miss. If you account for it in the solution, you still miss because the thermal is not a constant. It breathes. It's stronger at the bottom of its cycle than the top. You can't solve for a variable that changes every 14 seconds. She lifted the barrel free of the chassis. "But you can commit to it. Fire into it at the right angle when it's at the right point in its cycle, and it carries the round where you need it to go. You use the vortex as a deflector." She said nothing, which was a yes. "That's not in any manual." "No," she said. "It's not." The radio crackled. "Haynes, Sierra, confirm hit." Poole keyed the radio. His voice was even, professional. "Target neutralized. Confirmed hit at 3,220 meters. Copy. Well done, Sierra." Poole lowered the radio. He looked at Reeves. She was packing the barrel into the case. "That's not a learnable skill," Kessler said. He was not being dismissive. He was being accurate. "What you just did, that's not something you can be taught." She closed the case latches. "Everyone gets taught," she said, "just not by the same things." The debrief was at 1,400 inches the command tent. Haynes ran it himself. Poole and his team, Calloway and Harlow, the intelligence analysts presenting the confirmation data. The room was cool. The generators had been pulling hard since the confirmation came in and the air conditioning was actually working for once. Reeves was not in the room. Calloway noticed that before anyone said anything else. The first 20 minutes of the debrief were standard shot confirmation, target verification, documentation for the record. The UAV footage had captured the hit with enough clarity that the intelligence cell was confident in the identification. The cell at the compound had dispersed immediately following the shot. No indication the direction of fire had been identified. Mission success. Then Haynes said, "Before we close, questions about the third shooter." Nobody spoke immediately. Poole said, "Who is she?" "Reeves," Haynes said. He said it in a tone that gave away less than nothing. "I know the name. I mean, who is she? What unit? What classification?" "She's on temporary attachment to this command. That's what you need to know." "Colonel," Poole said, and there was no insubordination in his voice, just precision. "I've been in precision fires for 16 years. I've worked with every Tier 1 sniper program this country runs, and several that belong to our allies. What she did up there does not fit any training profile I've ever seen. The technique she used, the thermal angle offset, is not an AFSOC approach, not MARSOC, not NSW. I've never seen it." He paused. "So I'll ask again." Haynes looked at him for a moment. "She was known as Callahan's Ghost," he said finally. The room went very still. Calloway had heard the name. He had heard it the way soldiers hear the names of extraordinary things indirectly, at a distance, through the accumulated weight of second-hand accounts. A shooter who had operated primarily in mountainous terrain, high altitude, extreme range. No confirmed record because the operations she'd worked had no records. She had dropped off the rolls approximately 4 years ago after an assignment that, according to the fragments Calloway had absorbed over the years, had gone very wrong in ways nobody specified. Assumed inactive, possibly separated. No one knew. "She disappeared," Calloway said. "She went somewhere else," Haynes said, which was not the same thing. "Is she active?" "Today she was." Haynes picked up his folder. "The record of this debrief will reflect a 2-man shot, adjusted for conditions, at extreme range. Confirm that both of you are comfortable with that record." He looked at Poole. "Poole. Pause it." "Yes, sir." Calloway. Calloway thought about what he'd seen on the spur, the dust on the hardpan, the way she lay, the shot that had not gone where it was pointed. "Yes, sir." "Good." Haynes stood. Debrief closed. Calloway was the last one out. He stopped in the doorway. "Colonel, why did she come back?" Haynes did not look up from the table. "She didn't come back," he said. "She was always here. We just stopped knowing where to look." Calloway spent 20 minutes after the debrief looking for her, not urgently. He was not certain he would find her. and he was less certain what he would say if he did. He walked the perimeter of Kestrel, the comms tent, the medical bay, the motor pool, the hardened structure that served as the intel cell. He checked the water tower and the shadow behind the eastern fence line, where people sometimes sat in the hour before dark when the sun dropped enough to cut the worst of the heat. She was not in any of these places. He found Harlow outside the barracks tent, cleaning the spotting scope with a cloth he'd been using since Calloway had known him. Harlow looked up. Looking for her, he said. Sort of. She left about an hour ago. Harlow went back to the scope. Caught a hello out to something south. I don't know what. Did she say anything? Harlow thought about it. I was walking back from the motor pool and she was at the landing pad waiting. I asked her if she wanted water. She said she was fine. He paused. She was reading a book. Paperback. Couldn't see the title. Calloway thought about this. Poole's going to write it up, Harlow said. You know that. I know. He's going to say it was an exceptional environmental read and an unconventional hold, attributable to significant field experience. He's not going to explain the technique, because he can't explain the technique. No. Does it bother you? That she just left. Calloway looked south, toward where the helo had gone. The sky was beginning to yellow in the west, the first hint of the afternoon's long cooling. The hardpan glittered. No, he said, and meant it. Some things don't need a ceremony. The weapon case was gone. She had taken it with her. There was no sign she had been in the barracks, the equipment bay, or anywhere else on base. The mug from the command tent had been washed and returned to the stack. The sandbag she'd used as a field rest on the spur was still up there. They'd left it when they came down. Calloway went back to overlook Sierra alone, late that afternoon, after the worst of the heat had broken. He climbed the spur in the long golden light and lay down at the lip where she had lain. He looked south across the hardpan. At 3 kilometers, the Karat escarpment was just a rough line against the horizon. Dirty orange stone, darker in the shadow of the late sun. The compound was invisible at this light, and this hour, absorbed back into the rock. He tried to see what she had seen. The thermal layer, the dust at 1,600 meters, the breathing of the air between the two ridge lines. He wasn't sure he could see it. He thought maybe he could see more than he had this morning, but that might have been the light, or might have been the fact that he now knew what to look for. Her footprint was still in the thin dust on the spur lip. One print, where she'd stepped when she came over the edge. The afternoon wind was picking up. In another hour, it would be gone. 2 weeks after Overlook Sierra, Corporal Vince Harlow found a book. It was on the shelf in the comms tent, between a water-stained copy of a military thriller and a magazine 3 months out of date. The shelf existed because someone had built it from scrap lumber and nobody had told them not to. And it had accumulated reading material the way forward operating bases always did, randomly, through donation and abandonment, without any organizing principle. Harlow found this shelf every few days on his way through. He'd never found anything worth reading on it. This one was different. A plain paperback with a cracked spine and no jacket. The jacket had been removed at some point, probably to protect it from humidity, or possibly just lost. The cover beneath was blue cardstock with black text, no image. The title was, On the Mathematics of Stillness, a study of projectile behavior in disordered atmospheric conditions. The author was listed as Dr. R. Hargrove, published by a university press whose name Harlow didn't recognize. It looked like a textbook, an obscure one. The kind that existed in very small print, runs for very specific audiences. He opened it. The interior was dense with equations and diagrams, the kind of typography that marked academic publishing, tight line spacing, narrow margins, no concession to the reader's comfort. Harlow was not a physicist. He understood perhaps one sentence in 5 on the first page he opened to. But the diagrams were interesting. They showed projectile flight paths in non-standard conditions, paths that curved, that bent, that behaved in ways that standard ballistic tables did not predict, not because of malfunction or randomness, because of specific, analyzable interactions with atmospheric structures. The thermal vortex was there. Chapter 7, with equations. On the inside front cover, in small, neat handwriting, 3 words, for the wind, no name, no date. He brought it to Calloway. Calloway turned it over in his hands for a long time. He read the inside cover inscription 3 times. He flipped to chapter 7 and read 2 pages before the math exceeded what he could follow, but what he could follow was enough. Someone had thought about this problem, had thought about it for a long time, rigorously enough to produce a book, and the thinking had landed on the same answer she had executed on a sandstone spur at 48 degrees. Except she hadn't used the book. She had arrived at the same place through years of doing what the book could only describe. He kept it. Later, months later, when Kestrel had been deactivated and the unit had rotated back through processing and Calloway was finally stateside, sitting in the passenger seat of a friend's vehicle on a highway in Georgia, watching pine trees go by in the low afternoon light, he would try to describe that morning on the spur to someone who asked. A fellow sergeant named Marcus Webb, who had heard a partial account through several intermediaries and wanted to hear it straight. Calloway tried. He talked about the thermal vortex, the wind cycles, the aim point that was wrong in every conventional sense. He talked about how she'd lain so still on the stone that she could have been part of it. He talked about the shot, and the silence, and the way the round had curved, visibly curved. At his magnification across that last 200 meters of desert air, he talked about the debrief and what Haynes had said and had not said. Webb listened to all of it without interrupting, which Calloway appreciated. What was she like? Webb asked. Calloway thought about the question the way he'd been thinking about it for 3 months, on and off, in idle moments. He had no answer that felt complete. He had fragments. The way she'd moved across loose shale, purposeful, economical, not wasting a step. The expression in the command tent, which was not alertness or boredom or anything he had a clean word for. The way her hands had assembled the rifle without looking at it. The same way an experienced mechanic reinstalls a part they've removed 1,000 times. The hands know and the eyes don't need to supervise. The single footprint in the dust at the lip of the spur. The inscription in the book, "I don't know," he said. And it was the most accurate thing he could say. "I don't think she was like anything." Webb frowned. What does that mean? It means most people, when you meet them in the field, you can fit them into a category, a type. You know the kind of soldier they are within the first hour. You know how they'll react under pressure. You know what they're going to say before they say it. You can place them. He paused, watching the pines. She wasn't like that. She was just exact. That specific, that exact, nothing extra, nothing missing. Like a tool, Webb said. No. He shook his head. Tools don't choose. Tools do what they're made to do, and that's all. He looked at the road ahead. She made choices. Every second on that spur was a choice she'd made a long time ago and just kept making, to wait, to watch, to not fight what couldn't be fought but to commit to it instead. That's not a tool. He turned the thought over. That's something the word tool doesn't reach. Webb said nothing for a moment. "Do you think she's still out there?" he asked. Calloway thought about what Haynes had said, the last sentence of it. "She was always here. We just stopped knowing where to look." "Yes," he said. They drove in silence for a while, and the road unwound through the Georgia pines and the light shifted through the canopy in long moving bars, and Calloway closed his eyes. He saw the hard pen in the morning light, white, flat, cracked at the edges, breathing. He saw the dust column at 1,600 meters moving in its 14-second cycle. He heard the rifle cough, that specific suppressed sound that was less a shot than a fact, announced once and not repeated. He watched the round curve over 3 kilometers of heated air and arrive at the only place it could have arrived given the choices that had produced it. He thought about what she'd said to Poole, which was perhaps the most important thing she'd said all morning, which nobody had written down and nobody would. "I'm not asking you anything. I'm telling you what your data is missing. There are people who treat the world as a problem to be solved against its resistance. They fight wind, correct for it, compensate, account for it as an adversary. They are good shooters. Some of them are exceptional shooters. The wind still wins sometimes. And there are, very rarely, people who have arrived at a different relationship with resistance, who have spent enough time in enough difficult conditions to stop treating the world as an opponent and start treating it as a system complex, unpredictable in detail, but not arbitrary, not chaotic, governed by principles that can be observed, timed, committed to. The wind is not the enemy. The wind is the condition. The question is not how to overcome the condition. The question is how to use it. That understanding is not in any manual. It cannot be taught in the time available to teach most things. It arrives, if it arrives at all, through thousands of hours in the conditions themselves, lying on stone and watching dust move, climbing ridges alone before dawn, adjusting and failing and adjusting again, until the gap between observation and understanding closes to something almost instantaneous. Until the data your eyes collect and the solution your body executes happen on the same timeline. She had that. He had glimpsed it for 40 minutes on a spur above a desert basin and would think about it for years. Outside the vehicle window, Georgia pines gave way to a bridge over a wide, green river. The water below moved without urgency, steady, purposeful, carrying everything it carried with no evidence of effort. It would reach the sea. It always did. The route it took was determined by the landscape it moved through, and it had learned the landscape over centuries, and the learning was now simply what it was. Calloway watched the river until the bridge was behind them. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the spine of the paperback he'd been carrying since Kestrel. For the wind, the kind of thing someone writes inside a book when they are not leaving a signature, when they are leaving a direction, when the real message is not about themselves, but about what they have learned to pay attention to. He kept it. He always would.